What is up, theology nerds? This is Tripp, and you're listening to the Homebrewed Christianity Podcast. That's right. This is the podcast where we don't want to think for you. We want to think with you, and we bring you ideological ingredients so that you can brew your own faith. Right? We just want to keep it tasty. No more light beer Christianity. We want it zesty, full of flavor, all sorts of different styles. We want to increase like the diversity of flavorful goodness on the little thingy over the bar where you put like the different beers on tap. And we think American Christianity should have a stack of tasty, diverse things to drink that inspire beauty, love, and justice. And we have different ingredients, and we hope it inspires you. That's what we're doing here. And today on the podcast is a man named Greg Garrett. Greg is an English professor at Baylor University. He is also like writes fiction. He writes movies. He does a lot of work on religion and pop culture. And he is here talking about a book called Living with the Living Dead, The Wisdom of the Zombie Apocalypse. That's right. We're going to talk about some zombies. There's a brand new book from Oxford University Press, Living with the Living Dead, The Wisdom of the Zombie Apocalypse. Now, if you know me, you know that I love some zombies. If you've never heard, there's some past episodes where we talk very extensively about zombies and theology and The Walking Dead and all that kind of thing. So we talk about that here. And it was fun. The difficult part was I really enjoyed his book. And it made me just want to ask him about all the things connected to the book that didn't get in it. And I'm like, why didn't you write an 800-page book? And Greg's like, I had to write a book people could read. I can't get in the weeds about the comic books and all this stuff. If everyone hadn't read everything and watched all the zombie movies, we'd leave people out. And I'm like, that's a good point. But don't you want to talk about it? So, I hope you enjoy this. It was a complete blast. And at the end, he's going to share some of his own personal story. So, and he'll mention that we talk about a couple of books he's written. They all slide together, and we had ourselves a good time. Before we jump in, I just want to tell you all something. If you are trying to think about what to do this summer, I have two options for you. One, Wild Goose Festival in North Carolina, Hot Springs, North Carolina, the mountains, July 13th to 16th. That's right. I love Wild Goose Festival. I love North Carolina. I love camping with 3,500 Christians that are like, let's talk about spirituality, arts, justice, and stuff. Those people, I like. I like the ones especially that buy me beer in the beer tent. And then I just talk to you. Well, this year at Wild Goose Festival, we're not just doing the podcast, and I'm doing a happy hour, doing a theological happy hour that's geared towards people that are in theological education, like in seminary, school, that kind of thing, or thinking about it. It's going to be fun. I'm excited about it. But also, this year, on Friday and Saturday, there's a Homebrewed Christianity podcast on the main stage. That's right. First day, it'll be like this podcast, the Homebrewed Christianity podcast. The next time, Homebrewed Culture Cast, Christian, Amy. Like, we're just pumped. We got a promotion to the main stage. That's right. And now, since there are bands playing on there late at night, we aren't going to be competing with the main band at night. So it'll be earlier in the day. That's why I'm telling you this, because we need support. You know what I mean? Like, not everybody at Wild Goose thinks that the best time to have a beer is like in the afternoon. But I know that Homebrewed Christianity listeners don't want to like make us feel bad just cracking one open on the stage and talking about theology. So bring your support. Also, let me know if you're going so you can camp with us. We're going to organize a camping area where hardcore podcast listeners or just people that want to talk theology till late in the evening camp near each other. That way, we don't have to go nowhere. We're just camping, chilling, avoiding mosquitoes, and conking out after we nerd out. Also, Theology Beer Camp, Oklahoma City, Denver. We're doing Theology Beer Camp. And Theology Beer Camp is everything you think it might be. In both cities, there are a host of local craft breweries all bringing beer. There is me and Peter Rollins. Peter Rollins is coming with me, and we are going to nerd out hardcore. We're going to have some like straightforward talks. We're going to have some arguments, and we're going to have theology games. We're going to have other games, like maybe like a cornhole tournament or something like that. We're going to have some excellent beer, excellent food, excellent people. We're going to have some games. We're going to have some live podcasts. And it's going to be like the perfect opportunity if you've ever said to yourself, like, who are the people that listen to this podcast? Are there other people that are thinking and asking the questions that I'm asking? This is the place to go. And it's going to be a blast. So go to theologybeercamp.com, get yourself your ticket. And here's the deal. when you get your ticket, it's like going to cover, most everything is going to happen. Like, you aren't going to have to purchase beer when you're there. You'll have a mug. You'll have a mug, and you'll just get to use it. You don't have to. There's like going to be some amazing food that'll be happening during it, and then the people and the nerdiness. Oh, and there's some things that I don't know. Pete and I are talking about them. I don't know when we're going to tell you, but there's a unique to summer beer camp ritual that we're going to do, and it will come across like, when Pete does very serious icon-like things. We'll take that, but then it also mixes with my sense of humor and type of thing, and they blend into a ritual. It's going to happen there that if it succeeds, you'll laugh and it'll be memorable. And if it doesn't, you'll laugh harder and it'll be memorable. But either way, it'll be a memory. So come on out. theologybeercamp.com. Now, are you ready for your zombie time? Are you ready for zombiness? Because I am. This is Greg. I hope you enjoy it. Talk to you later. Peace. Hello, homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Tripp, and today on the podcast, we have a professor of English. That's right. It's a language, and he studies literature, and he teaches at Baylor University. That is Greg Garrett. And not only that, but on top of writing fiction and nonfiction, he also works in media, pop culture, and the like. Lives in Austin, like everyone that lives in Texas gets to pick where they wants to live. And now he's here because he has 2 books. That's right. This guy must have a publicist like a champ, because he has 2 books that showed up at Homebrewed Christianity on my shelf. One, Living with the Living Dead, The Wisdom of the Zombie Apocalypse, and then a spiritual memoir called Crossing Myself. And so this man can't stop publishing, but he's stopping long enough to talk to us. So thank you for joining the podcast, Greg.
Oh, Tripp, it is such a pleasure to be with you.
Oh, well, I'm pretty excited because, honestly, I was a giant zombie fan, and I was one of those people that once nerd culture got popular, just seemed like the universe was doing better.
Right.
And so maybe the place to begin is, when was it that you realized that your interest in zombies was an interest in something more than just like gore, terror, fear, and a way to distract yourself from the impending finitude of our existence?
Yeah. And, that is such a good question, because for many people, there is this, when we look at secular culture, we're looking at something that entertains us and distracts us. But one of the sort of core beliefs that I have as a cultural critic and theologian is that a lot of times the stories that we're drawn to are stories that we really need for some reason. Mm-hmm. And so I think probably I first started realizing that zombies were central to who we are when I was reading the comic, The Walking Dead, and wrestling with the fear and the terror, and then all of the really positive themes that I saw in it, the powerful community and individual transformation and the other things that kind of went along with that. And what brought this book kind of to the fore for me is that it's the second book that I've written for Oxford University Press, which is one of the great publishers on the planet. And I'm so honored to be doing a second book with them. The first book that we did was a book called Entertaining Judgment, which was about stories of the afterlife. Mm-hmm. And there was a chapter in that book about the undead, mm-hmm. because, 3 of the most sort of potent and powerful stories for us in the 21st century are about these people in this sort of in-between place, ghosts, zombies, and vampires, that we can't kind of put in one place or another. And when I was writing Entertaining Judgment, the draft chapter on the undead was at 120 pages and growing. And, in a 300-page book, you sort of realize this is actually not what I wanted to do, because I wanted to talk about heaven and hell and purgatory at some point. And so my editor said, I think there's another book here. And I said, yeah, there absolutely is, because this is a story that people are so drawn to. It's so prevalent, and we find it in movies and in some of the most popular television shows on the planet. and in games and apps, and even in sort of ridiculous kind of material culture things. There are zombie lottery tickets. You can do a zombie pub crawl.
Why not?
And why not? And so this book kind of offered me the chance that I'm always looking for when I write nonfiction, which is to ask some questions and to learn something. And for me, the question that I wanted to ask was, why are these stories, which feel so sort of repulsive and off-putting in some ways, so central to our post 9/11 experience? Mm-hmm. And what I discovered was the kind of startling thing that it's not kind of outre, it's not gauche, it's not gory. It's a thing that we've been doing for at least 600 years. And when we look at the Middle Ages, when we look at other sort of kind of pressure points in human history, the other places where I kind of found people raising the dead to get up and walk around were World War I in the trenches, and Hiroshima and the Holocaust. And then 1968, when the first Romero zombie film comes out, one of the kind of annus horribilis of American history. And it sort of turns out that zombies are just kind of the latest manifestation of this. How do we wrestle with the idea that we could be dead? Mm-hmm. I mean, all of us will be at some point. Valor Margulis, as we hear from Game of Thrones, all men must die. And how do we wrestle with the idea of living in a dangerous world? What are the ethical choices that go along with that? And what are the things that kind of make us fully human, even when we are terrified? Because that's the hard place. That's the pressure point for us. How do we live into what it means to be human, even when we could be gone at any moment?
Mm-hmm. So what do you think it was, like, if you're looking at the history of the undead and the way in which these kind of pressure points in history in the West occasion of kind of opening up a fictional place where there's a large interest in wrestling with these questions of the living dead? What was it that 9/11 triggered in the West imagination that kind of unleashed the button? Because in one sense I could say, why didn't kind of the growing awareness of climate change do it? Or sure, why not nukes? What was it that 9/11 did that made that kind of, released the gusher?
Well, for us here in America, and in America, we have had this protection. We've got these two vast oceans, and we've got, the huge power that we grew into in the 20th century. And when 9/11 happened, it was kind of a wake-up call to us that the rest of the world had already experienced, that, it is a chaotic world, it's a difficult world, and you can be touched in wherever place you are. And so 28 days later came out just shortly after 9/11. It was sort of the rush of zombie stuff. Mm-hmm. And people who have taken a look at it have said that a third to a half of zombie films, for example, in history have come out since 9/11. And I had done a bunch of research on post 9/11 pop culture. And what we sort of discover is we in America realized for the first time what our friends around the world had realized, that it's a fragile place. Mm-hmm. And we can be touched, and in sort of in the words of the Ash Wednesday liturgy, you are dust, and to dust you will return. And so what sort of happens in this post 9/11 reality is we realize, okay, we face this reality of death, and what kind of comes into it as well is that we have all of these other kind of challenges, threats, however you want to think about them, that zombies can stand in for. Mm-hmm. Max Brooks, who is sort of the prophet of the zombie apocalypse, the writer of the zombie survival guide and World War Z, has said that basically what zombies do for us is they're multivalent. So they can be terrorists, or they can be Ebola, they can be Zika, they can be economic unrest, they can be political disaster. They stand in for whatever is for us that threat that just keeps coming and keeps coming. And so what I think zombies do for us is they give us the chance to wrestle. Mm-hmm. And that's what any good story does, is give us the chance to wrestle with the things that are kind of freaking us out.
You talked about the narrative as like an archetypal narrative for these impending threats, and you emphasize kind of the global nature of the threats. And I wonder if what makes something a global threat has to do with, the scope of it, or is it our kind of ever-present awareness that there is no way you can really protect from it?
That is a really lovely way to think about it. In these stories of the zombie apocalypse, sort of what we're dealing with is the idea that the world is full of chaos. And, we were talking about 9/11. What 9/11 sort of revealed to us is that we are not as protected as we think we are. Mm-hmm. And because I've published this book with Oxford University Press, I've given a lot of thought to British popular culture and sort of the British situation. And, the British have dealt with terrorism for years. And so one of the things that's formative for them is not just the 7/7 event when, radical terrorists, set off bombs throughout London and killed a zillion people, but also Irish terrorism. Mm-hmm. And this idea that, you could get up in the morning and you could be vaporized, and that's just sort of the reality that you deal with. And the thing that I think is really important about this is how do we deal with the fear? How do we deal with the idea that that we could be a victim at any moment? And do we sort of close down and sort of ask ourselves what are the things that I'm willing to accept to protect myself? Or do we say, I'm going to live my life? And that's sort of the interesting thing when we look at terrorism on the European continent and in the UK. There's this very powerful sense in Paris, for example, where we've just had this terrorist attack on the Champs-Élysées, one of the most elite shopping streets in the world. And, our friends in Paris are saying, they're not gonna scare us out of our everyday lives. Because fear is a diminishing thing. And when we look at the Christian Gospels, we have to balance that off against Jesus saying, don't be afraid. Mm-hmm. Peace be with you. Because our human tendency is to say, I am really upset about this. I'm really scared about this. And maybe I'm willing to accept some limitations on my personal freedom. Maybe I'm willing to accept some ethical restrictions in order to protect myself. And when we look at the gospel, and of course the sort of transgressive nature of this book is that I'm looking at zombies and the gospel. Mm-hmm. But the thing is that Jesus tells us, don't be afraid. Everything is in God's hands. And that is kind of the place where I am. I'm getting ready to leave for a month in Paris. And some of my friends are like, how can you do that? How can you go to this place that looks like the front line? And what it feels like to me is just, if I'm going to live my life, I can't be frightened about this. I've got to make decisions that are in line with my values and with my faith. And that for me was the most interesting thing about writing this book. The Christian ethicist Scott Bader Say wrote about how we live in a world where we are full of fear. Mm-hmm. And what the gospel invites us to do is to say, don't be afraid. Peace be with you.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I find interesting about the zombie apocalypse narratives is that the very structures that we become conservative about and want to preserve after something like a terrorist attack are the very structures that just don't exist in a zombie apocalypse, be it like free market capitalism,
Right.
property rights, nation states, these type of things. And so I wonder what you see as taking place where these like kind of narratives where we're imagining what it's like to wrestle with these ethical predicaments that you talk about, or to think about the nature of community and stuff, that the place in which we go to reflect on it as a culture is a place where the very structures we're going to die to protect don't exist.
Yeah. And that is kind of the amazing thing about the zombie apocalypse, because one of the things as a storyteller, because, you know, I'm a novelist as well as a person who analyzes stories and theology. And what makes for great stories is pulling out all the supports from people. It's why Dickens writes about orphans all the time. It's because, you know, these are people that have all the sort of supports and different kind of societal things pulled out from under them. And what makes for a great story is this whole idea that we have to figure out who we really are in a place where all the things that organize us, all the things that legislate us, all the things, you know, that we sort of rely on to tell us who we are, no longer exist. And that's why the zombie apocalypse is such a great story. It's sort of like a laboratory for human understanding. And there is a chapter in my book, Living with the Living Dead, which is on the ethics of the zombie apocalypse. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I had mentioned Scott Bader Say, my friend who's the Christian ethicist who talks about how we live sort of post 9/11. And his teaching about how we live in a world of fear is that there are certain things that if we are people of faith, we have to like lean into in a way that is counterintuitive. He talks about the power of hospitality and welcome and love in a world full of fear. And in that ethics chapter, I talk a lot about Cormac McCarthy's novel, The Road, mm-hmm. which is this post-apocalyptic novel, and there are no actual zombies in the sense of, you know, sort of reanimated corpses. But one of the huge threats in the world of The Road is these people who look at human beings as resources. And there's a horrific scene in The Road where the major characters encounter these people who are kind of locked away in the cellar of a house as a larder. You know, it's like in this post-apocalyptic world, human beings are food. You know, and so the thing that I think the ethics chapter in Living with the Living Dead tells us is that we have to live into love and community and welcome, even in a world where there is this danger, because that's what we're called to. And what I come back to over and over again is this chapter in the Gospel of Matthew. I think it's Matthew 18. And it is what scholars typically call the discourse on life in the faithful community. And Peter asks Jesus this question about how often we have to forgive people. And forgiveness is one of the hardest things for human beings. You know, it's we expose ourselves mm-hmm. to emotional pain. And I think when Peter asked the question, he was hoping that the answer would be like once or twice. And depending on how we translate the Greek, it's like, you know, and basically it's 1 billion times. It's over and over and over again. Mm-hmm. We are called to live into this vulnerability and I know how hard this is because, I love my family and I would do anything to protect them. But there's also this faith call to us to say, however dangerous the world is, Jesus is calling us to something bigger, something higher. And, it may mean your life because, in the Johannine tradition, it's, you got to be willing to give your life. And that actually is something that comes from The Walking Dead. Rick, in an early episode of The Walking Dead, talks about how you have to be willing to give your life for the people you love, which is, basically almost word for word. There is no greater love that a person has than to give his life for his community.
Mm-hmm. Well, when you think of the way the ethical questions come up in a zombie apocalypse, I think it forces us to ask questions that we're not forced to ask today. And especially as Americans, the post 9/11 context, there are ethical questions that have been made for us we're unaware of, or worked on being unaware of. The way in which we surveillance is one, or torture is another,
right?
Or whether or not there's high quality logic used on invading other countries and all sorts of things, where the normal way in which Americans exist, we expect all sorts of other countries to behave in ways we would never allow, right? Like imagine living in Austin and Mexico occasionally shoots, not even very accurate, propelled grenades into the United States of America, right? Like there would not be even a two-state solution taking place. Like we would just, you wouldn't even have to call the army in. There's enough guns in Texas. There
are enough guns in Texas.
So one of the things that I find about thinking ethically in a zombie apocalypse is it forces you to realize how much inherent violence there is at the base of human community and existence, right? Like you can lay your life down for your kid or your friend or the people with you, but that might also mean doing things that in a world where the violence that we benefit from as people of privilege is distance from us via a drone or whatever, is right in your face. Right. And the preservation of your community and your people leads to violence, and to not even do the violence or to possibly care for the other and stuff in a zombie apocalypse is dangerous. In the Fear of the Walking Dead, they do a great job at, we're going to help this woman who's, having a baby. Obviously you're going to help them. And then it leads to them getting taken over in the ship, and stuff like that. So what do you think is the gain for kind of forcing these ethical questions into kind of what were those stretching devices back in the day? I think that's kind of where it
the rack, maybe?
Yeah, a tourniquet.
Okay.
Tourniquet, it starts to pull you. It's like, now let's ask the ethical questions.
Well, that is one of the really wonderful things about Cormac McCarthy's The Road. Because the main characters are a father and his son. And over again, they encounter people, and almost always the people are dangerous to them. And there is this sense that the father has, and he actually expresses this at some length to the son. It's like, I am the person who has to protect you. This is my job. God has given me this job to protect you. But the son keeps asking, can't we help them? And there's person after person after person after person they encounter. And the father is living in this place of fear. And he says no, because, the danger is too great. But the son keeps saying, isn't there something we can do? And Cormac McCarthy is one of the great writers of American literature. And he is also like one of the bleakest. I mean, his worldview is, we are totally screwed, and I know that he went to Catholic school, so he got plenty of fallenness in the course of his development. And so we sort of have this sense in the world of Cormac McCarthy that human beings are really messed up. And as a father, I totally understand that. When I was writing my book about U2, I ran across this thing where Bono said, "I am a Christian pacifist. But if somebody threatens my family, I will stop being a Christian pacifist so quick, it will make your head spin." And I totally understand that. But I also understand this pull of the Son. Can't we help them? And the hope of the Son makes the road actually one of the most hopeful of Cormac McCarthy's novels. There is this thing at the end of the book, and the father dies, and the son spends 3 days at the side of his father, just weeping over the corpse. And then he goes back out to the road, and a man comes along. And what he's been taught by his father is that every human being is dangerous. And, you've got to run, you've got to resist. There is no hope. And the son has this conversation with the man. And the son asks him these important questions, among them, which are, do you eat people?
It's a good question to ask.
I mean, that's a useful kind of, if you're putting a questionnaire together, that would be toward the top. And he says, no, we don't eat people. And the son says, do you have children? And he says, yes, I have a son and a daughter. And what this man does is he adopts the son. He brings him into his community. And it is heart-wrenching because the world of the road is the world we live in. This world of fear, this world of every person I meet could be dangerous to me. And when the son asks the man if he can trust him, the man says, you're just going to have to see. And that's that is life for us because, we don't have the privileged place of God. We don't know where we're going, and we just have to sort of live into this story that we've been given, where we're told not to fear, and that God has the best in mind for us, and that even the end of the world is not the end of the world for us.
Mm-hmm. So when you think of zombies as opposed to kind of the other mythical creatures you talked about, like a vampire or ghost and this type of thing, one of the things that, or even like aliens or the kind of other super or science fiction type things, is the idea of the contagion. And the contagion in zombie stories has changed over time, but it's almost always been connected to some element of hubris at the heart of Western culture, be it the pride to change our genetics, right? Or to nuclear power, or some way in which we see ourselves as grasping a power that leads to this encounter with the living dead. And I wonder what you make of that kind of uniqueness, that the threat in a zombie apocalypse is something everyone's already a potential of, right? Like you kind of mentioned that in the book, like you're living with the title, you're living with the living dead, that the fear is as close to you as you are. And so often, I think, in the zombie literature and in The Walking Dead, I love the comics a ton because it wrestles with that idea where, at first you're just trying to survive, and then you realize that the biggest threat isn't the zombies, it's all the people who are also zombies. And that the solution to invaders from the outside, I think we see in comic book movies. Like we've had multiple comic book big movies end with a rich guy and a bomb fixing it. Be it if it's Batman or Iron Man,
Avengers,
and the Batman. But a zombie apocalypse one, like there's no outside force you just get rid of, and the problem's fixed. And it's connected to this pride that's kind of really shaping, I think, Western grabs for power, technology, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I love that idea because, in the original George Romero's zombie mythos, the zombies are activated by an American satellite returning, kind of irradiated with some kind of zombie raising thing. And in the Quentin Tarantino zombie film, it's like it's these chemicals that sort of leach into the atmosphere, and it causes all this. I think when we deal with this, we are wrestling with our own ideas about human perfection and how we are trying to live into lives that are informed in some way by the advances that we are able to make. And it makes me think about this kind of wonderful trope from Mystery Science Theater, where they talk about, he interfered in God's domain. And that is the thing that comes up over and over again in some of these stories, the idea that because we put our fingers into a place that we're not sort of intended to go, that it causes these sort of cataclysmic consequences for us. And I think this fits into the zombie story. You were mentioning global warming earlier. And, the current administration has an apparent problem with the idea of climactic change, that human beings are involved with this. But in one of those sort of miraculous internet kind of clicking things, last night in the middle of the night when I could not sleep, I found myself on a site that was showing all of the American cities that were going to be inundated by the rising sea level over the next 20, 30, 50, 100 years. And I think one of the things that the zombie apocalypse story does for us is it presents the idea that we are the authors of our own destruction. And that's a powerful scientific thing, but it's also a powerful theological thing. We are, as Augustine said, we are drawn to our disordered desires. We want the wrong things, looking for the right things. And it takes us to these places that are in some way damning for us. And, at 2:00 in the morning last night, I was watching the monuments of Washington, D.C. get inundated by the rising tide. And in a way that I had not thought about while I was writing Living with the Living Dead, I was seeing the ways that we are the authors of our own destruction. And that's a theme of the zombie apocalypse. But one of the wonderful things about that is that we also have, sort of theologically speaking, that however broken we are, however messed up we are, however disastrous our decisions, the cosmos trends toward this place of hope and optimism and love. Martin Luther King used to talk about the arc of the universe, being toward hope and justice. And, whatever terrible decisions we make, God finds a way to redeem those somehow. And thanks be to God for that.
So throughout the book, you kind of pick up on different characters from different shows, be it like Walking Dead, but you also broaden out the nature of the undead, and than just like the more straightforward, like World War Z type stuff. Mm-hmm. So I'm interested. What are your favorite characters in Zombie Apocalypse? And why are you attracted to those characters?
I think my ground zero absolute favorite character is Shaun in Shaun of the Dead. And partly it's because this is, it's a tremendously entertaining movie. and he is funny, and he is, he is smart. But the theme of that movie is that we are so closely linked to The Walking Dead, which is what Angela Kang, the writer and producer of The Walking Dead, told me one time. The zombies are not the monsters in The Walking Dead. The humans are the monsters. Mm-hmm. And what Shaun of the Dead does for us is it tells us that we are sunk in this living death. And, one of the great points of that movie is that there is so little difference between us. We get up, we labor, and, for many people, there is this sense that what we do doesn't matter. And I am lucky enough to be in a job where I feel like I get to be a part of a transformational thing. I teach and I talk and I work with students, and that's a lovely thing. But if you're working in a service job, or if you're doing something that feels like you're repeating things over and over again, and in Living with the Living Dead, I talk about, and this is a minor thing, but yet I talk about it. I talk about unloading the dishwasher every single morning. Mm-hmm. It's like, how many times am I going to put this glass back into the same place in the cabinet? And when you look at Shaun of the Dead, and part of it is, a reference to Dawn of the Dead, the George Romero film that's set in a shopping mall, mm-hmm. where you have the human characters who are like almost no different from the zombie characters who are wandering around this shopping mall. The idea that a lot of critics have looked at is that we are sunk in this living death. And I think of Irenaeus, who talked about how the joy of God is the human being fully alive. And what does that mean for us? What does it mean to be fully alive? And I think one of the things that it means is living into this reality where we are not sunk in ourselves and not sunk in our routines, but that we're willing to take a step out and to take chances and to live into that whole idea that Jesus talked about, where he says, peace be with you, fear not. So Shaun of the Dead is one of the central kind of stories for me. And then I think about Columbus in Zombieland. I am a capital I introvert on the Myers-Briggs. And I hope some people out there will identify with that.
I'm married to a capital I introvert. And mm-hmm. There are many different ways of being human.
Yeah. And, Columbus has created all of these Zombieland rules mm-hmm. about how, as an individual, you save your life. But what he comes to realize is that saving your life on your own is inconsequential. And in Living with the Living Dead, I come back to Desmond Tutu and this whole concept of Ubuntu, the South African idea that I am because we are, that community is actually the formational place where we live. And when you look at Zombieland, which is this hugely entertaining film, but Columbus comes to this point where he sets aside one of his Zombieland rules, don't be a hero. Because he recognizes that the most important thing we're called to is heroism. It's this self-sacrificial thing. It's the thing we were talking about in John. Be willing to risk your life, to give your life for the people that you love. Because if you live your life only for yourself, it is this tiny, narrow sort of thing. And I know this from my own experience. There was this stretch in my life where, suffering from clinical depression, I lived in a 450 square foot apartment in Austin and sort of put up this wall around myself. And I survived, but it wasn't living. And in The Walking Dead, I remember Glenn and his love interest talking about, this is how we stay alive. And what she said was, no, this is how we breathe. So it's like the biological functions versus the spiritual functions. This is what we're called to. And it is a scary thing, but it's also the thing that makes us human as opposed to the zombies. And one of the fun parts of living with the living dead is there's a section of one of the chapters where I talk about, what makes us human? What's the difference between the living and the living dead? And, sort of what I came down on hard was the idea that we are willing to get beyond our biological processes and live into the idea that there's something bigger than us that we have got to sacrifice ourselves for, even, if it means our death.
Yeah. You bring up, Maggie early in the book. Actually, one of the, when I knew I was going to like the book, was when you went through all the, Walking Dead characters and kind of talked about the driving existential questions that are moving Michonne and Carl and Rick and Daryl and Maggie.
Daryl.
And so one of the things that I found helpful in that is, or maybe shocking, or maybe I'm just interested in what you think about it. I won't even say what I think about it. But why is it that a TV show like that can help us ask and think in more sophisticated and critical ways about what it means to be human, and the church tends to avoid even creating a space where you're honest about the ugliness and the death that exists in our life, let alone call us into deeper, more rich living? Why is culture ask better questions about what it means to be human than the ones that really dominate much of Western Christianity?
Oh, Tripp, that is such a good question. I have been lucky enough over the years that I have done a bunch of interviews with Christian media who were less interested in evangelism than they were in what it means to be human. But one of the things that I've heard over and over from them is that it is central to our experience to be able to tell the truth. And it's a funny thing to be on a radio show and to have an evangelical host say, "Thank you for telling the truth." And what they typically said following that, and I was raised Southern Baptist, and I've not been part of an evangelical tradition for many, many years. But I know that tradition, and I appreciate the tradition because it's my family of origin. My brother is a Southern Baptist pastor in Alabama. And one of the things that they often tell me when I do Christian media is we don't tell the truth about our experience. And I know that from my many years at Baylor, where pastors have told my students that if they prayed harder, their lives would be better. If they prayed harder, their depression would lift. If they prayed harder, something would change for them. And the truth of reality is that we live in a broken world. And that's one of the places where the zombie apocalypse intersects with our experience. Mm-hmm. We live in a broken world. And however you understand that theologically, and I don't have a dog in this race, but however you understand it, we are broken. And whether you think of that in terms of a fall, or whether you think of that in terms of the idea that human beings experience the imperfection of reality as opposed to the perfection of the heavenly realm. What it means to be human is to wrestle with the fact that we live lives that are full of pain and brokenness. And, whenever I have students at Baylor who have not experienced that, I just say, God bless you, and I hope you never will. But I have experienced brokenness in really powerful ways, and I've experienced grace and love and forgiveness in really powerful ways. And the gospel message for us is that if we live in this world full of brokenness and pain and heartache, we also understand that there is this heavenly realm in which love and forgiveness and grace are extended to us. And they're extended to us, through the scriptures. They're extended to us through powerful stories. They're extended to us through human community. They're extended to us through liturgy, and they're extended to us through sacraments. And, that has been life-saving for me. Mm-hmm. And not to be melodramatic. But when I wrote Crossing Myself, one of the central parts of that book was about, this is what I understand about being human. Because it is so painful to be human that I almost stopped being human. I almost checked out. This whole human life thing was too much for me. But grace was extended to me through powerful stories and through people who stepped in and were the face of God for me, and through the sacraments and a sort of sacramental vision of the world in which even things like zombie stories can tell us that there is more to this reality than the brokenness and the pain that we experience. So one of the most powerful things for me in the last year has been the last season of Game of Thrones. Mm-hmm. And I am really drawn to the character of Jon Snow, not just because he knows nothing, and I totally identify with that, but also because it is a powerful retelling of the gospel story, where we have this person who sacrificed his life on behalf of the people that he loves and comes back. And, we don't know what he's going to do, but I am sort of hoping that the storytellers are going to take this in a place that's going to be useful for us. And what it tells us is that, even if you give your life for the people you love, there is this powerful sense that the universe is going to wind up in a good place. J.R.R. Tolkien, on fairy stories, used to talk about the concept of eucatastrophe. Mm-hmm. And that is central to this book on the zombie apocalypse. It's the last chapter, and it's sort of the climax of the essay that I've written in Living with the Living Dead. And the idea that Tolkien had was that even in the worst of times, God is moving. And eucatastrophe is this sort of Greek understanding that there is a good catastrophe. Even in the worst that can happen to us, God is moving. And, it's the story of the crucifixion and resurrection. It is at the heart of everything we believe as people of faith.
Well, and I actually think this connects to a conversation a couple of my friends were having, and they're actually like TV writers. So they think mm-hmm. I get if a philosophy PhD can really ruin writers discussing a TV show. But we got an argument about the end of the Walking Dead season this year where, Rick gets betrayed. But for some reason, the first group he's ever trusted in a long time are people that threw him off a trash heap.
Exactly.
And somehow have Eastern European accents in Georgia or Virginia or whatever. Would you ever trust that many people with Eastern European accents in the South? No. You already know not to. And he's a sheriff from the South. The only thing white Southern men dislike, their prejudice against Eastern Europeans is bigger than any other they have, and they have plenty of them. So I'm sitting there going, this isn't going to end well. But they turn the back on him, and And you think, Carl's about to get killed in front of Rick, and then the tiger comes flying through from the people, and you got people from the hilltop and people from the kingdom, and they're all there, and they're like, "Oh, this is so cheesy. It all works out." Blah 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 blah. I was like, no, it's like the Falcons and junk in Lord of the Rings, the eucatastrophe bit. So you have like one character like chooses to kill herself for the well-being of the others in the casket, which then sets off this whole thing, and Rick insists in his face, the kind of act of daring resistance and faith, like, no, this is not the end. Like, looks at him right in his face, and that's right when it comes through, and like, that's cheesy, it all lined up or whatever. And I'm like, no, like it's the time a whole group of people decided we're going to stand together, and they trusted each other, and they're acting, and it in the middle of a zombie apocalypse, in the face of the impending war next season, which I hope just they don't go too fast. Let's have lots of fights. It's great, but like the breakthrough moment was this like cheesy, that it all lined up moment and friends showing up, but no, like that's part of the story that you catastrophe bit or the Falcons coming or all that kind of stuff is part of the narrative. And I was like, and now I'm going to be like, well, I don't know. I talked to Greg Garrett, and he agrees with me it's not a cheesy out. It's actually a way of communicating the power of community and friendship as forms of resistance in a world controlled by the dead.
I can't actually say that much better, but there is this powerful sense that in a narrative where things have been prepared for us, we believe that things come together. And, every narrative has this sort of triangular structure where a conflict is presented, and it gets more and more complicated, and things look worse and worse. And at the end of every second act of every great 3-act story told in history, it looks like disaster. I teach Magnolia often in my film classes at Baylor. And it's not a zombie apocalypse story. It's just like a human brokenness story. And what I like to say about Magnolia is that at the end of the second act, it looks like no one is ever going to see the light again. Mm-hmm. No one's going to be redeemed. It's like the end of the world. And that is sort of the connection between the zombie apocalypse and every important story we tell. At the end of the second act, it looks like the end of the world. And then the third act is eucatastrophe. Unless it's a tragedy. And, there are tragedies, and that's a powerful thing because sometimes things don't get redeemed. And we understand that. Sometimes the hole that has been dug for these characters is too deep, and they can't get out of it, and, for whatever reason. But in many of the stories that we love so much, there is this powerful sense that things come together. And, there is a grace and a love and a structure, and there is some kind of force in the middle of the cosmos that says, I know you thought that things were over, but it's not over, because that is not the way things work. And so in many of the zombie stories that I talk about in the book, it is chaos and entropy, and that's the Romero story. So, at the end of Night of the Living Dead, the one sort of admirable character, the African-American man, gets shot by a sheriff's posse. And we're like, oh, God, that's awful. But then we've got the end of 28 Days Later, when we hear that actually there is still something somewhere. The plane flies over, and we're like, it's like the branch in Noah's Ark. Mm-hmm. And there's the moment at the end of Shaun of the Dead where the British Army rolls in these huge trucks and just sort of crushes zombies beneath their tires. And we're like, oh, thank God. And there's the moment at the end of Zombieland. And even though the world is still full of death and destruction, at the end of Zombieland, this family unit has been created. And Columbus has come to this realization that this rule that he's lived by, don't be a hero, is not a rule you can live by. Mm-hmm. be a hero becomes the rule for him. And he looks around and he says, if you don't have people that you love, if you don't have people who will test you and uphold you and love you, then you might as well be a zombie.
Yeah. So one of my favorite lines in in Crossing Myself is where you said that life is full of things we think are destinations when really they're only rest stops. And only because, right, like that's not something you could have said about those destinations at the beginning of the book. Mm-hmm. And I think this gets explored in your own narrative there in a lot of these zombie apocalypse narratives where oftentimes the narrative scope that we're looking in is one that's so small we can't find hope in it.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if you can, share a bit about yourself. Like, what has it been like to, put out a new edition of your own autobiographical spiritual memoir, and what is it like to return to a narrative that you kind of wrote, shared, I'm sure talked about then, and then now it's coming back? Like when you reread your own kind of confession of that experience and transition and processing in your life, what wisdom have you gained with, more destinations having taken place since then?
Oh, that is such a brilliant question. I am just coming off 5 sermons, teaching moments, however you want to think about it, at a church in Houston, Ecclesia, Houston, mm-hmm. where I was talking about the novel The Prodigal that I co-wrote with Brennan Manning. And one of the things that I talked about, because Ecclesia Houston is this place pastored by my friend Chris C. And Chris C. is one of the major characters in Crossing Myself, because he is one of those people who sort of stood up for me and was the face of God for me in a really difficult time. And so like I am actually coming off this weekend, like this immersive weekend, like when you preach 5 35-minute kind of sermon teaching things, you are plunged back into that experience. I have not suffered from clinical depression for over a decade, thanks be to God. But what I've been telling people is that, the experience of this 10th edition or 10th anniversary edition of Crossing Myself coming out is, that it has made me think about this powerful sense of gratitude that I have, that there were people and institutions that were willing to sort of step in the gap for me. And at Ecclesia this weekend, although I was talking about the prodigal and talking about sort of the brokenness of the character in that story, Jack Chisholm, and how, when we start the story, he's drinking himself to death at a hotel on the Caribbean in Mexico. And I know a little bit about drinking myself to death, although not in Mexico. I was just, happy to be in Austin drinking myself to death. But in each of our stories, in Jack's story and in my story, and actually in Brennan Manning's story, there is this powerful sense of people showing up for us. Mm-hmm. And so the story that I told this weekend, and Chris was out of the country. He was in the Dominican Republic, and he recorded this really lovely sort of introduction to me, which was embarrassing to me. And then I got up on stage and said some things that probably would have been embarrassing to him. But I talked about how he was the person who was the face of Christ for me in my most difficult moments. And in an interview on KUT Austin, the NPR station in Austin a week ago, I talked about how basically what Chris had told me on one of the worst nights of my life when I thought I was going to do myself in, he said, "You're going to be a dead body over my dead body." And so there's this very powerful sense that, however difficult things are in the world, there is the chance for people to show up for us. It's the thing mm-hmm. that Jesus was talking about in John, put yourself out there, be willing to give everything for the people that you love. It was the thing we were talking about in The Walking Dead, be willing to give your lives for your community. And so I come back to this thing with, incredible gratitude, because all I can do when I think about, where I am now in 2017 and where I was in 1999, 2000, 2001, 2002, grace is the only word that applies here. In Crossing Myself, I talk about this sort of pivotal moment where I gave up. And for many years, and it's a story that Thomas Merton tells in The Seven-Story Mountain, where he finally sort of gave up and gave himself over to God. And I was raised in a Southern Baptist tradition, and I kept some sort of core part of myself separate from God for all those years, where I said, I'm going to make these decisions. I'm the master of my own ship. And then I woke up one morning and I just said, I am doomed. If I am left in charge of myself, I am doomed. And so on that morning, I sort of said, God, if you want me to survive, you're going to have to drive this car, because I have done everything I can and I can't do anymore. Mm-hmm. And so, part of it was that surrender, and part of it was that willingness to make myself vulnerable and to tell Chris and other people, I can't do this anymore. And then the third part of my story, and this relates back to the zombie book as well, because I talk about the importance of community. And as a capital I introvert, he says again, I have come to realize how essential community is for my well-being. Mm-hmm. And so I walked into this church in East Austin, this historically African-American Episcopal church, where I was welcomed and loved and accepted, in the same way that Chris did for me, in the same way that other people did for me. And there was this very real sense that, as sort of Chris was expressing, you're going to be a dead body over our dead bodies. And the lesson from Crossing Myself, and the central point in that chapter on the community and living with the living dead, is that we need each other. Mm-hmm. And it's a countercultural story in American culture, where we're encouraged to lift ourselves up by our bootstraps and to be radical individuals. But that was the most essential revelation of my life, that if I am left to my own devices, I am doomed.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think a lot of people have had that experience and have been there, but not all of them share the story so publicly. So I really appreciate you sharing it here, but also in the book. So maybe you could end by letting people know where they can go to connect with you on the internet.
On the internet, exactly. Well, I would encourage people to become Facebook friends with me. I do a lot of my posting on Facebook, and it is a sort of strange, radical place. I have refused to open up an author page, because part of what my understanding is of community is that I am not a product and I'm not a platform. I'm a human being who has these experiences that I try and share with people in hopes that they will be helpful for them on their journeys. And so I would encourage people to connect with me there on Facebook. And I do a little bit of Twitter. So just twit, maybe. But at Greg Garrett is my Twitter handle. And then I would encourage people, if they get a chance. I do a lot of speaking, and I travel the country. And part of my vocation now, post-seminary and post-survival, is this idea that I'm going to go out and meet with people and have conversations about the things that really matter to us. And some of those things are about my books, but the most important connections that I make are with people where they are. And so I would encourage people to just sort of keep an eye out. And if I'm in your neck of the woods, 50 miles away, come see me. I will make it worth your while.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Greg, for taking the time to talk and to share. And I'm looking forward to hearing from all the listeners as to what parts kind of really stuck out to you, and honestly, give it another reason at some point to talk more about zombies and Game of Thrones and all that kind of stuff, because you can only talk about 19th century German idealists so many times. You know what I mean?
All right, brother. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. It was a blast.